On a grey September morning in 1944, a British paratrooper lay in the ruins of a Dutch house, listening to a sound no airborne soldier ever wants to hear. Tank engines. Not one. Several. The floor trembled. Plaster drifted from the ceiling, and from somewhere outside Arnhem Bridge came the deep metallic clank of tracks on cobblestone. He had a Piat, a spring-loaded anti-tank launcher that British soldiers both relied on, and cursed 3 rounds of ammunition, and no sign of the armored regiments that were supposed to rescue him. Above his head, a battered radio crackled uselessly. The men in that house didn't know it yet, but the units meant to reach them were stuck dozens of miles away on a single, choked Dutch road, fighting their way past burning trucks and blown bridges. They also didn't know something else. 72 hours earlier, in a quiet office in England, a young intelligence officer had looked at a stack of photographs and said, in effect, "If we drop our men there, those tanks will kill them." His name was Brian Urquhart. He was 25 years old. He was absolutely right, and his superiors took one look at his warning and sent him on medical leave for nervous strain. You think you've heard crazy war stories? Wait till you hear this one. Because Operation Market Garden isn't just the tale of a daring plan that failed. It's the story of how a victorious army, convinced it was on the verge of ending the war, began to treat bad news as a kind of illness. And when that happens, the man sounding the alarm becomes more dangerous than the enemy he's describing. Let's rewind. September 1944. On paper, the Allies are winning big. Paris is liberated. Brussels is in Allied hands. In just 3 months, they've broken out of Normandy and chased the German army across hundreds of miles. Newspapers talk about victory by Christmas, but if you zoom the camera back, the picture is much less tidy. The Allied armies have outrun their own supplies. Fuel is low, ammunition is tight. Huge quantities of food and petrol are still bottlenecked at the beaches of Normandy, because the major ports Antwerp, Rotterdam either aren't captured or aren't usable. Imagine trying to run a marathon, then realizing all your water is still back at mile 10. That's the Western Front in early September. Into this mess steps a British field marshal with a reputation almost as large as his ego, Bernard Law Montgomery, Monty, the hero of El Alamein, the man who beat Rommel. Montgomery in 1944 is a study in contradictions. Methodical, cautious in North Africa, meticulous about preparation. But now, with the German army retreating and an American rival named Patton racing for headlines on his flank, Monty wants something he hasn't really had yet, a spectacular war-ending masterstroke. His idea is brutally simple on a map. He'll punch straight through the German lines in the Netherlands, cross the Rhine, and drive into the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr, cut off the enemy's capacity to fight and end the war months early. To do that, he proposes something audacious, the largest airborne operation in history. 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, plus a Polish brigade will drop behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. Their job: seize a series of key bridges over waterways and canals, creating a slender corridor. At the same time, a powerful British ground force, XXX Corps, will race up one main road and link up with them, bridge by bridge, all the way to a city called Arnhem on the lower Rhine. If it works, Monty's tanks end up on the far side of the Rhine, in terrain the Germans consider their last natural barrier in the west. Huge risk. Huge reward. They give it a name with a kind of Boy's Own magazine swagger. Operation Market Garden. Market for the airborne element. Garden for the ground thrust. And on paper, again, it looks gorgeous. Arrows sweeping across maps, bridges neatly labeled. Drop zones plotted as if the enemy were nothing more than stationary. There's just one problem. The northernmost bridge, the one at Arnhem, the far end of the offensive, is also the most distant. The British 1st Airborne Division, about 10,000 men, will have to land, organize, march several miles through or around a built-up town, seize that bridge and hold it for Well, depending on which briefing you attended, anywhere from 2 to 4 days. That's a very long time for lightly armed airborne troops to cling to a single point, deep in enemy territory, without heavy support. It's like asking a man with a pistol to hold off a tank battalion at a crossroads and telling him, "Don't worry, the cavalry will be coming, probably soonish." Now add this. Arnhem and its surroundings in mid-September 1944 are exactly where 2 SS Panzer divisions' elite armored formations have been sent to rest and refit after the slaughter in Normandy. That's the part the men drawing arrows on the maps really don't want to hear. This is where Brian Urquhart walks on stage. Not to be confused with Major General Roy Urquhart, the commander of 1st Airborne Division. Yes, there are 2 Urquharts in this story. Yes, it confuses people to this day. Brian, the younger one, is the divisional intelligence officer. He's been with airborne forces since their early days, and he has a reputation for being sharp, stubborn, and unwilling to tell senior officers what they want to hear just to make them feel better. Picture him, narrow office, low ceiling, piles of air photos. It's mid-September, just days before the operation. He's exhausted like everyone else, but that's normal in wartime. He's also very, very good at his job. For weeks, reports have trickled in from the Dutch resistance. There are German armored units in and around Arnhem. Some mention SS troops, some mention tanks hidden in woods. Then come the aerial reconnaissance photographs, black and white images of roads, fields, and forests around the town. At first glance, to an untrained eye, they're just smudges and shadows. But that's literally Brian's specialty. He starts going through them, frame by frame. And then he sees them. Long, dark shapes under tree cover, popped in orchards, lines of vehicles. The kind of pattern you get when you're trying to hide something big in metal from prying eyes in the sky. He pulls older photos for comparison, checks again. The same areas were empty days before, now they're full. He overlays the photos on maps of the proposed drop zones and approach routes to the bridge, and what emerges is the image that will haunt him for the rest of his life. His division, 1st Airborne, is scheduled to land almost on top of what appear to be elements of 2 SS Panzer divisions. Now, let's pause here, because it's tempting, with hindsight, to imagine that everyone else was blind and only our hero could see. That isn't quite true. Other intelligence channels, including Ultra Intercepts and higher-level assessments, had also mentioned the presence of SS units in the Arnhem area. But in the heady atmosphere of September 1944, SS units refitting is heard as tired remnants, probably on their last legs. The German army is supposed to be collapsing. The word refit sounds soothing. It suggests vulnerability. What Brian is seeing in those photos suggests something else. Enough tanks and armored vehicles to make a mockery of any notion that this will be a soft target. So he does what intelligence officers are supposed to do. He takes his findings up the chain. Here's where things start to go sideways. The commander of 1st Airborne, Roy Urquhart, is not blind to danger. He's already concerned about other aspects of the plan, the distance of the drop zones from the bridge. For one, they can't land on top of the objective because of flak, terrain, and a refusal by the Air Force to fly repeated sorties too close to known anti-aircraft positions. So the British paratroopers will drop several miles away, then march into Arnhem. That alone introduces delay and risk. Now Roy's intelligence officer is telling him, by the way, the area between us and that bridge is crawling with SS armor. Roy listens. He's troubled. He tries to raise the alarm with higher headquarters, specifically Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, the dashing, well-connected commander of the British Airborne Corps. Browning, in turn, has his own staff, his own political instincts, and his own sense that this operation is his ticket to glory. Already you can feel the friction, can't you? Have you ever been in a workplace where bad news has to climb a ladder of people whose careers depend on things going right? You watch the language soften on each rung. This could be a catastrophe, becomes there may be some local opposition. By the time Brian makes his case in front of Browning and other senior officers, the room is primed not for shock, but for resistance. He lays out the evidence. The photographs, the resistance reports, his assessment that two SS Panzer divisions, 9th and 10th SS, Hohenstaufen and Frumsberg, are in the Arnhem area, with tanks and armored infantry. He points out that lightly armed paratroopers with a handful of anti-tank weapons are not ideal opponents for Panthers and Panzerives. There are versions of this meeting that differ in detail, but they agree on one thing. Brian is not thanked for his diligence. He's treated as a problem. At least one senior officer suggests he's exaggerating. Others argue that even if SS units are present, they're refitting, which apparently means they won't fight. Think about that logic for a second. You send battle-hardened SS formations back from the front to rest, repair their vehicles and absorb replacements. They're sitting on a major river crossing near your national frontier. And when an entire British Airborne Division drops in their backyard, they'll stay in their pajamas because it's their day off? If you're thinking, that sounds insane, you're ahead of some of the men in that room. For Brian, the stress is crushing. He's been working almost without sleep. He knows, in excruciating detail, what happens when airborne troops land near armor. He's seen it in Sicily, in Normandy. He presses his point. Hard. Too hard for the comfort of people who have already mentally signed off on the plan. Somewhere along the line, concern about his message morphs into concern about his mental state. He's described as exhausted, overstrained. There are reports of him suffering something close to a nervous collapse. Now, was he genuinely on the edge? Possibly. War does that. Long hours, responsibility. The knowledge that your analysis could doom or save thousands. But listen carefully to how he's handled. Instead of saying, "This man is waving a red flag, we'd better revisit our assumptions," the solution becomes, remove the man with the red flag. He is effectively grounded, sent away on medical leave, labeled as suffering from nervous strain. And the warning, the specific, data-backed warning about panzers near Arnhem is filed, noted, then politely bulldozed under an avalanche of wishful thinking. That's your first, "oh come on" moment. A modern viewer might be tempted to scream at the screen. But we're not done. The way the plan is built almost seems custom designed to ignore every uncomfortable truth. Let's walk through a few of the key decisions. First, the drop zones. 1st Airborne Division is not allowed to land directly on, or even very close to the Arnhem Bridge. The Air Force commanders insist on drop zones farther out because of limited suitable terrain, fear of flak, and the need to pack thousands of paratroopers and gliders into a narrow air corridor. So, instead of one decisive coup de main assault right on the objective, you get a compromise. A single battalion assigned to make a rapid dash to the bridge, while the rest of the division lands several miles away to the west and secures the landing zones for the second day's lift. You're already hearing the clock start to tick. Every hour that passes after those men hit the ground is an hour for German commanders to react. Second, the ground route. 12th Corps, the British armor and infantry rushing north, have to move along essentially one main highway, elevated above the flat Dutch fields, lined with ditches, traversing embankments and canal bridges. It will be known as Hell's Highway for a reason. One knocked-out vehicle at the wrong point, and the entire advance can halt for hours. Third, the scale of ambition. This isn't just one bridge. The airborne element is expected to seize and hold a series of bridges at Eindhoven, the Hel, Grave, Nijmegen, and finally Arnhem over about 60 miles. That means 3 divisions scattered along a very thin corridor, each with its own problems, each waiting for that column of tanks and trucks grinding up the road. And finally, the command culture. Montgomery's plan is approved. Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, is persuaded after much debate. Political capital has been spent to get Market Garden greenlit. American airborne units are involved. British prestige is involved. Whole corps are being committed. At that point saying, wait, maybe this is actually a terrible idea because of some SS tanks in the target area, becomes deeply inconvenient. So the tanks are downgraded, turned from a glaring red warning sign into a footnote. If that sounds harsh, consider this. Much later, after the war, Montgomery would describe Market Garden as 90% successful. That's like describing the Titanic as 90% buoyant. September 17, 1944. The day it all begins. Before dawn, airfields in Britain roar to life. Over 2,000 transport aircraft and gliders are lined up across dozens of grass strips. Pilots are briefed. Engines cough and splutter in the chill. Men check their chutes, their weapons, the letters from home stuffed into their pockets. Among them are thousands of young British paratroopers, the Red Devils of 1st Airborne Division. They've trained for this. Many of them are bored, in fact, after missing out on D-Day. Arnhem is their chance to finally do what they signed up to do. They've been told in general terms that resistance will probably be light. Some whisper about SS in the area, others dismiss it as rumor. Up they go. From the ground in southern England, you'd see wave after wave of C-47 Dakotas and tug aircraft hauling gliders lifting into the sky, forming up into great airborne serpents stretching for miles. Civilians stop their cars, get out, and stare. The sky is buzzing with war. From inside the aircraft, you get the smell of oil, canvas, fear, and bravado. Men shout to be heard over the engines. Someone cracks a joke. Someone vomits into a bag. Someone sits very still, gripping the handle of the jump door, already somewhere else in his mind. Across the channel, in the Netherlands, people are waking up. Church bells, bicycle wheels rattling over cobbles. And then, a distant, growing sound. Engines. Thousands of them. If you talk to Dutch civilians who were children then, they remember this with a kind of stunned awe. The sky filling with aircraft. Parachutes blooming like white and cocky flowers. For a moment it looked like salvation, literally falling from heaven. At about the same time, in a villa near Arnhem, a German field marshal named Walter Modi is having a very bad morning. He's the commander of Army Group B, the man tasked with trying to hold back the Allied advance in the West. And he's chosen Arnhem as his headquarters for a few days' rest and reorganization. According to some accounts, when his staff first hear about parachutes dropping, they assume it's a small raid or maybe even a drill. Model, once he grasps the scale, reacts with a mixture of fury and cold efficiency. He narrowly avoids being overrun by advanced elements of 1st Airborne, and then begins turning the very SS units the British tried to write off into the spearhead of his response. That's another "oh come on" moment. The British dropped their elite airborne division almost on the head at one of the German army's most capable defensive commanders. Let's zoom in on the British drop. The first lift goes in under decent weather. Parachutes open. Gliders crash land with their usual bone-rattling violence, some breaking apart, men and jeeps and artillery tumbling out in clouds of dust and splinters. But overall, casualties on landing are manageable. The division gets down. Then, little frictions begin to add up. The drop zones are farther from Arnhem than is ideal. Units have to assemble, find their offices, round up equipment containers. Radios don't work properly. This is a chronic problem for British airborne communications sets that fail, frequencies that don't match, fragile valves and batteries, and it manifests again here, right when they most need robust, long-range links. Imagine trying to coordinate thousands of men over miles of unfamiliar roads and fields, with the added spice of German patrols, and your wireless sets keep cutting out or only work line of sight. That's 1st Airborne on day one. Still, orders are orders. 3 main spearheads push toward Arnhem. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion, makes good time. They use back streets, cycle paths, initiative. They fight through scattered resistance and, by evening, reach the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. That's one of the heroic high points of the whole campaign. A few hundred men, dug into the buildings around one end of a massive steel bridge, surrounded by German forces, holding out far longer than any reasonable planner had a right to expect. But while Frost's men dig in, the rest of the division is running into the reality Brian Urquhart tried to warn them about. SS reconnaissance units, supported by armor, begin probing the British columns. In some cases, they hit paratroopers marching in loose formation along roads, not yet fully deployed. Casualties mount. Routes get blocked. Commanders reroute units through woods and fields. That takes time, Every hour that ticks by is an hour for the Germans to bring more of their refitting armor into play. Behind all this, miles away, XX Corps finally crosses its start line and begins its advance up that one narrow highway from the Belgian border. Let's talk about that ground advance for a second, because it's easy from the comfort of hindsight to say they were too slow. British tankers and infantry were not deliberately dawdling. They faced roadblocks, blown bridges, determined counterattacks, especially against the American Airborne Divisions securing the southern bridges. At places like Sonn and Nimwegen, the Germans fought hard. At Sonn, the bridge was blown in the face of the advancing tanks, requiring engineers to bridge the gap under fire. But two things are true at once. One, the men on the ground were fighting like hell. Two, the operation as designed left them almost no margin for error. If you drive a column of tanks and trucks up a single raised road across flat polder country, you are accepting that a disabled vehicle, a destroyed culvert, or a counterattack from either side can bring your entire timetable crashing down. And that's exactly what happens repeatedly. There are moments that feel like pure tragicomedy. At one point, a single burning truck blocks the highway and it takes hours to clear. Meanwhile, on either side of the road, fields that look firm on the map turn out to be boggy in real life. Tanks that try to go around bog down. Engineers curse and dig and haul. The whole column shudders to a halt, as if someone has kinked a hose. Up ahead at Arnhem, that kink in the hose means Frost Battalion isn't getting relieved on day 2. Back at Market Garden headquarters, communications and expectations collide. Browning has placed his Corps HQ at Nimwegen, which itself will become a major battle for the American 82nd Airborne, another controversial decision, because the aircraft used to cart his staff and their equipment across the channel could arguably have been used to carry more fighting troops too. Arnhem on the first day. And then there's the bridge at Nimwegen itself. The 82nd Airborne, under General James Gavin, is tasked with capturing a series of hills and river crossings. They do so with tenacity and grim efficiency. But the main road bridge at Nimwegen becomes a sticking point, literally. Gavin wants to prioritize the high ground to prevent German artillery from dominating the area. British commanders are desperate to get the Nimwegen bridge taken sooner to get XXX Corps moving. When they do finally launch the assault that most people remember, the famous daylight river crossing in flimsy canvas boats under direct fire, it's an act of staggering courage. American paratroopers paddling across the wall, men killed in heaps in the water, survivors clawing up the opposite bank and storming German positions. It's also happening on September 20th. Frost's men at Arnhem have already been fighting, surrounded, for days. Here's another 04 moment. The planners of Market Garden assumed the Nimwegen bridge would be taken on day 1. It falls on day 4. Time again is bleeding away. Let's go back to Arnhem itself. Imagine the bridge, long steel span looming over the Rhine. On one side, a small knot of British airborne troops in battered houses and cellars, their payats and rifles and dwindling boxes of ammunition. On the other side, German armor and infantry building up, probing, hammering, bringing doctrine and firepower honed on the Eastern Front to bear on a few hundred men. The Germans test the defenses with armored cars and light tanks, then upgun and up-armor their approach. There's a famous moment where a German armored column tries to storm across the bridge and is decimated by anti-tank fire from Frost's positions, vehicles burning in a chain along the span. The defenders cheer briefly, but ammunition doesn't magically reappear. Radios still barely function. Medical supplies are running out. To the west, the bulk of 1st Airborne Division is bottled up in and around the village of Oosterbeek, cut off from the bridge by German blocking positions and counterattacks. Divisional HQ is under shell fire. Houses become strong points, then rubble, then graves. Civilians shelter British wounded in their basements, turning family homes into field hospitals. One Dutch woman, Kate ter Horst, ends up with around 250 wounded British soldiers in and around her house. They call her the Angel of Arnhem. She and other civilians care for dying men with almost nothing. A few morphine syringes, torn-up sheets, rainwater collected in buckets. You want quiet horror? Picture a paratrooper, gut shot, lying on a Dutch living room floor. looking up at a painting on the wall that reminds him of home, knowing that the tanks he was told would come up that road aren't coming. That was the dread Brian Urquhart saw in those photographs. Not an abstract enemy order of battle, but the shape of hundreds of little tragedies just like that. Could anything have saved 1st Airborne at this point? Realistically, no. Even if XX Cole had reached Arnhem faster, the Germans were already reinforcing the area heavily. The notion that a relatively narrow armored column at the far limit of Allied logistics could burst across the Rhine and exploit deep into Germany in September 1944 was probably always a fantasy. Remember those fuel shortages? Those overstretched supply lines? They didn't go away because someone drew a bold arrow on a map. But inside the bubble of market garden planning, fantasy had taken on the weight of reality. Doubts like Brian's had been treated as symptoms of personal weakness rather than as prompts for organizational adaptation. Here's another warning voice we haven't talked about yet. General Stanisław Sabowski, the Polish brigade commander. He too expressed grave reservations about the plan, about the drop zones, about the narrow corridor, about the assumption that German resistance would crumble in the face of airborne daring. After the war, when Market Garden's failure needed a scapegoat, so Sabowski, the inconvenient, outspoken foreigner, would find himself blamed in some British circles. His brigade, which had fought bravely under impossible conditions, was tarnished to protect more senior reputations. You seeing a pattern? Silence the awkward voices. Promote the narrative that the plan was sound, but unlucky. In the last days at Arnhem, luck has left the building entirely. Frost's men at the bridge are overwhelmed after ferocious, close-quarters fighting. German tanks and assault guns blast buildings at point-blank range. Smoke, screaming, collapse. The survivors are captured or slip away in ones and twos. At Oosterbeek, the British perimeter shrinks, then shrinks again. Ammunition runs out. Men fight with captured weapons, with grenades, with bayonets. Rain turns the fields to mud. Artillery churns the orchards into splinters. Across the river, units of the Polish brigade make it across in dribs and drabs under fire, too few and too late to change the tide. At higher levels, the decision is taken. This can't be sustained. Operation Berlin, the code name for the withdrawal, begins. Under cover of darkness and smoke, engineers in small boats shepherd around 2,000 survivors across the Rhine to the south bank, to relative safety. Wounded men who can't move are left behind, along with medical personnel who volunteer to stay. From the roughly 10,000 British airborne soldiers who went in, about 8,000 are killed, wounded, or captured. That's an attrition rate that would make even a First World War general blink. For the Dutch in the Arnhem area, the price is only beginning. The Germans, enraged by Dutch support for the Allied operation and fearful of further uprisings, forcibly evacuate civilians from Arnhem and surrounding towns. That winter, the Netherlands endures the hunger winter mass starvation in the western provinces as rail strikes, German reprisals, and destroyed infrastructure combine to produce famine. There is a direct line from the failure of Market Garden to some of those empty dinner tables and children with swollen bellies in 1944-45. Meanwhile, at Allied headquarters, the post-mortems begin. Montgomery's assessment? Market Garden was, he insists, 90% successful. Only the final bridge at Arnhem eluded them. It's a breathtaking turn of phrase. Technically, yes, several of the bridges were captured and held. Tactically, where several of the bridges were captured and held. Tactically, brave men did remarkable things. But the strategic aim crossing the Rhine and outflanking the Ruhr failed completely. Calling that 90% successful is like calling a space mission 90% successful because the rocket made it off the launch pad before exploding. Why use that language? Partly human nature. No one at that level wants to affix the word failure to their legacy. Partly politics. Montgomery is in fierce rivalry with other Allied commanders. Market Garden is his big play. Admitting it was fundamentally flawed would hand ammunition to his critics. So instead, he and others lean into a narrative of brave near miss. If only the weather had been better. If only the Het Corps had moved a bit faster. If only a few more gliders had landed on time. The structural flaws, the single road, the optimistic intelligence assumptions, the dispersal of airborne units, the underestimation of German resilience are downplayed, and the role of warning voices like Brian Urquhart barely mentioned. Brian himself survives the war. He goes on to a remarkable career at the United Nations, working on peacekeeping and international diplomacy. He writes about Arnhem and Market Garden with a mixture of pride in his comrades and lingering anger at the way intelligence was handled. He remembers vividly what it's like to stand in front of powerful men and show them evidence that contradicts the story they've already told themselves. And here's where this stops being just a World War II story, because you don't need to wear a uniform or draw arrows on a map to recognize what happened to him. How many times in history or in your own life has someone looked at the data or at the reality on the ground and said, "This is going to go badly," only to be sidelined because their truth was inconvenient? It might be a junior engineer warning about a faulty part, a doctor pointing out a dangerous side effect, a financial analyst waving red flags about a bubble. In September 1944, it was a 25-year-old intelligence officer saying, "There are SS tanks near Arnhem. If you want one haunting human-scale detail to carry away from all this, consider this." While the RAF reconnaissance aircraft were photographing those tanks, and while Brian was circling them on, prints with a pencil, somewhere in those same woods, German mechanics were working on engines, tightening tracks, welding armor plates, getting those vehicles ready for their next fight. 3 days later, some of those same tanks were rolling through Dutch streets, their commanders peering out through periscopes at parachute canopies caught in trees, at British helmets behind windows, at Dutch civilians pressed into doorways. On one side of that moment stands raw steel and doctrine and momentum. On the other side stand men with piats and guts, and a warning that never got a fair hearing. You can't blame every casualty at Arnhem on one ignored memo, of course. War is messier than that. Market Garden failed for a whole constellation of reasons: hubris at the top, logistical overreach, optimistic timetables, communications failures, misread intelligence, the stubborn, deadly resilience of an enemy everyone was sure was finished. But if you trace the arc of those 9 days in September, you'll keep coming back to the same crossroads, the place where evidence met ego. In a way, Arnhem wasn't just a bridge too far, it was a question too dangerous. What if we're wrong? That too many people in charge didn't dare to ask out loud, so they asked something else instead. What if we're right, and we pull this off? There's always a strange, seductive glow around that question. It can light up rooms, move armies, make careers. But it can't, on its own, protect a single paratrooper in a Dutch living room from the sound of tank engines coming closer. In the end, history doesn't care how glorious your arrows looked on a map. It remembers who listened and who didn't.